Right, so this video is going to give you 5 signs you're not an ENFP. The ENFP is a fairly common source of mistyping. I'm talking ESFPs, ENTPs, INFPs, INFJs, ESTJs, yes, for some reason, ESTJs as well. The list goes on. And as with the other videos in this series, I'm not going to be using the MBTI dichotomies to help you clarify whether or not you are this type. The whole N versus S thing, the whole P versus J thing, because I do not believe it is reliable. What's more, these very dichotomies are bound to change over time. And as such, it is irresponsible to prescribe a person a consistent cognitive makeup on the back of their personality traits. And before I dive into this video, I just want to recommend to anybody who hasn't already done so to check out the CPT Explained playlist, because that will explain in detail the terminology I'll be throwing around herein. Sign number 1 that you are not an ENFP, cognitive extraversion, the NE variant. Here we will both be defining what cognitive extraversion actually is, as well as how it uniquely applies to the ENFP's dominant pairing. And by pairing I mean the 2 functions that ENFP engages of the primary extroverted orientation. Now, to be cognitively extroverted does not mean bouncing off the walls in an endless torrent of energetic sociability. Rather, to be cognitively extroverted is to have a cognition that operates more as an extension of external interaction than it does separate from it. As such, it is perfectly possible for the cognitive extrovert to prefer their own company and avoid intense stimulation. While extroverts do tend to report a higher capacity for stimulation, this is just a correlation and not a universal trait. It is also important to note that the extroversion of the ENFP derives from their dominant function of extroverted intuition. The ENFP tends to crave extensity over intensity of experience, owing to the breadth of this dominant lens. As such, unlike the ESFP, who really hones into intense singular experience, the ENFP may actually prefer a variety of experience of a less intense nature. And this very extensity lends external experience a more abstract and even surreal quality, as various perceived qualia are kind of blended together into a single whole. Imagine having a curry and mixing the sauce and the rice together, rather than keeping them separate. That's how the NE dominant likes to roll. The tendency of this type to blend external experience together makes for a reality that is viewed much more conceptually than it is concretely, all the while remaining very much an extroverted experience. This is because, as conceptual as reality is, this conceptualization operates in tandem with external interaction. And this does not mean that ENFP will be any less theoretical or creative than an introvert. It simply means that whereas an introvert is relatively detached from external experience, the creativity and insights of the ENFP are much more attached to external experience. And you can view this as a predominantly reactive cognition. Cognition here operates more in reaction to external stimulation than it does autonomous from it. And this is opposed to the proactive cognition, that is, cognition for its own sake, of the introvert, which is much more fueled by the detachment from external reality. But it is important not to be too binary with the application of these terms. This refers much more to the sum of a whole. If an individual has a reactive cognition, this means that the majority of meaningful thought and general flow state are extensive of external interactivity. It does not therefore mean that this individual lacks proactive cognition. Everyone will be both. The extrovert simply favors the former over the latter. Sign number 2 that you are not an ENFP, the NeTe dominant pairing. As aforementioned, the ENFP is an NE dominant, therefore craving experiential extensity over experiential intensity. And this is owing to the nature of extroverted intuition in dominant position. This external lens function perceives so much information at once that it effectively becomes necessary for the type to form inferences and associations between otherwise vaguely perceived components in order to effectively fill in the gaps of external reality. What's more, being in dominant position, extroverted intuition in the ENFP is convergent, unlike the divergent observational extroverted intuition of the INFP. The extroverted intuition of the ENFP effectively converges upon select few external contingencies in order to actively explore them in external reality. Far from a linear function, convergent NE, being more action-oriented, tends to take multiple possibilities and blends them into synergistic unison in order for them to effectively all be pursued at the same time, with minimal effort on the ENFP's part. As such, ENFPs tend to be rather effective at pursuing multiple projects alongside each other, and the more extroverted variants of ENFP, especially, will tend to have calendars absolutely rammed full of activities. And it is through this external engagement that the ENFP creates novel concepts and ideas. It is not so much that the type favors action over conceptualization, as much as these two processes just naturally being intertwined with one another. What may appear like a process of movement for the sake of movement is actually the medium upon which the type's creative insights depends. And this is particularly the case here owing to the nature of the ENFP's extroverted intuition. It's very important to bear in mind that functions operate in pairs rather than separate processing units. Unlike the NeFe of the ENTP, which is more active in social abstraction, the NeTe of the ENFP tends to be more active in objective abstraction. Conceptualizations of this type therefore tend to have a highly actionable component, and ENFPs do tend to pursue multiple things alongside each other in order to maximize the output of ideas and perspectives. NeTe tends to excel at blending and weaving external resources together, and ENFPs tend to fall often into a kind of liaison role as they hop between, let's say, one department and another. And therefore it is not unusual for an ENFP to have a rather nomadic vocation, hopping between different jobs and roles, for example, as they seek to maximize NeTe extensity. And it is this very desire to pursue everything at once that allows innovation to occur. Having multiple projects, for example, running in parallel, automatically causes the mind to form associations and bridges between them. It is not multitasking as much as effectively blurring the lines between various external concepts in order for them to become whole. But of course it is entirely possible for this 1,000 things at once attitude, given the limited resources of the human mind, body, and life as we know it, to result in creative burnout and frustration for this type. But suffice to say, this very everything at once attitude does lend the ENFP a natural impetus towards looking for associations and synergistic intersections between all that the type pursues. As such, a kind of creative resource management is a very natural gravitation of this type, as they intuitively spot a need in one area and equally intuitively see how another area may very naturally make up for that need at no additional expense. With 1,000 different things in your calendar, it kind of becomes necessary for you to find a way for them to all synergize with each other. And the TE-NE dominant pairing of the ESTJ would probably relate to this as well. Unlike the TE dominant variant, however, the NETE of the ENFP is much more conceptually and experientially oriented. The activities they tend to fill the calendar with are those that tend to give them a kind of creative fuel and offer kind of conceptual exploration for its own sake, rather than as important steps in a grander TE-NE objective design. This natural gravitation towards what I will describe as metatasking, however, does have its caveats. Without sufficient type development insofar as SETE is concerned, this type can suffer in the need for extensity over intensity from a lack of natural concentration, particularly over prolonged and sustained bouts. So at the worst, you will have a type kind of jumping from one pursuit to another without ever really getting anything done. As such, it is not entirely unheard of for an ENFP to really get the ball rolling on multiple new exciting projects, but fail to anchor in sufficiently in order to get the projects past their initial inception phase. At their best, however, you have a type so seamlessly integrating multiple different creative pursuits alongside each other that they may very well give off the impression of having a limitless pool of energy. In reality, however, this is not so much the abundance of energy as it is the ingenuity of NETE. And in many ways you can consider the ENFP's NETE dominant pairing like a sun. It tends to generate as much energy as it consumes through the process of fusion. And you may even have an ENFP in your life who occasionally comes up with things such as energy creates more energy. If, as many of us are naturally inclined towards ultimately ineffectual multitasking, you find yourself much more effective when you hunker down to a single task at any one time, without a natural and intuitive compulsion to seamlessly blend and integrate multiple different pursuits together, it is unlikely you are an ENFP. On the converse, if you rather naturally excel at intense singular focus, naturally entering the zone as you hone into the exquisite details of the task at hand, it is again unlikely you are an ENFP. What's more, the nature of extroverted intuition dominance is to form inferences and associations between otherwise vaguely perceived external components in order to effectively fill in the gaps of external perception. And the forming of associations between all of these perceived components is not something this type just does for fun, for recreational purposes, but rather is the very means by which this type can actually perceive reality in the first place. If novel association forming is more secondary in your psyche, or perhaps these associations are formed more internally, autonomous from external interaction, it is less likely you are an ENFP. And the ENFP is also a lens dominant. Extroverted thinking is auxiliary to a dominant, experientially oriented function. And with experiential novelty being prioritized here, the emphasis is much more upon new concepts and ideas than steps in a TE-centric master plan. Sign number 3 that you are not an ENFP, the extroverted thinking auxiliary function. Assisting any exploratory agenda is an extroverted thinking auxiliary function. So as previously mentioned, the objective nature of this codec function tends to lend the type a certain forward momentum, as the conceptualization of new ideas tends to hinge upon the active exploration of those ideas in external reality. And it is this function that allows the ENFP to entertain all of the various different pursuits in a systematic manner without a feeling of overwhelm. However, unlike their TE dominant counterpart, that is the ESTJ, extroverted thinking within this type is much more volitional than it is compulsive. As a result, while the conceptualization of this type does tend to be much more active than it is passive, the emphasis is much more upon the generation of new ideas and concepts than it is upon their full realization. The TE auxiliary is, as the name auxiliary would imply, used in a much more assistive capacity towards a more experiential, conceptual, NE dominant agenda. While of course this function can certainly be trained to be used more for its own sake within an ENFP, the emphasis is usually more upon the conceptualization of new ideas than upon their thorough exploration and external manifestation. A more typical pattern for the ENFP would be to start more projects than they finish. And herein lies a caveat of the extraordinary idea generation capacity of the NETE pairing. The challenge lies not in overcoming an obstacle on a path, but rather holding to that path without simultaneously trying to embark upon others. Generally, an ENFP is more likely to generate myriad different paths to be pursued across the course of a single year, holding fast to them for as long as A, they are novel, and B, they are not yet displaced by a fresh new one. Because as beautiful an idea an ENFP may have, novelty does tend to take precedence here. And it is not unheard of for an ENFP to drop a extremely meaningful pursuit when a less meaningful but more novel one becomes available. A trick for this type, absent extensive type development, is to ensure any pursuit that they undertake comes with an adequate supply of ongoing novelty, as well as the freedom to entertain new connections along the way. While of course there will still be concessions, this would yet reduce the chance of the current project being displaced by an unrelated new one. And an additional trait of this more volitional extroverted thinking lies in its inconsistency. You see, the extroverted thinking with the ENFP isn't always entirely switched on. So this can make for a high degree of extroverted thinking ingenuity and project orientation one minute, and the complete absence of analytical thought the next, as conscious rational agenda tends to be subsumed by entirely more feeling-based processes. And it's worth mentioning the FI authority I'm going to go into in a little bit tends to significantly hamper introverted thinking, that extensive function of extroverted thinking, when it's engaged. What's more, consistent analysis and organization can actually cause this type to tire out a little bit. Generally, the TE auxiliary of this type is used in short, intense bursts to both kickstart and synergize creative pursuits. And indeed, a big reason why this type tends to be so efficient in their extroverted thinking employment is because otherwise the function may burn out. So if you find logical pragmatism tends to take priority over the novel conceptualizations and pursuit of new ideas, it is unlikely you have an extroverted thinking auxiliary function. Furthermore, if you find your extroverted intuitive exploration to be secondary to practicality, coming back to that line of reasoning, will it work? Your dominant function may be Te in this case rather than Ne. And if you find precise logical analysis to be an ongoing constant in your mind, easily honing into the specific details of any internal or external mechanism, it is unlikely you have the much more holistic and generalist dominant NeTe pairing. So I know before that you are not an ENFP, the introverted feeling authority. The external world is not explored for its own sake, but rather at the behest of introverted feeling values and self-expression. Contrary to popular belief, the ENFP isn't just bouncing from one thing to another just for the sake of their own creativity and novelty of experience, but rather as a means towards authentic self-realization. Generally, the greatest drive for this type is acting in accordance with their own moral compass, and as such, authenticity tends to be very high on this type's list of priorities. Indeed, out of all of the types, the ENFP tends to have the lowest tolerance for what might be considered inauthentic behavior. But equally, this type can admire those who remain true to themselves in the face of adversity. Valuing of authenticity is very much a byproduct of the sheer individuality imposed by introverted feeling in authority position. What's more, the introverted feeling codec of this type is paired with an introverted sensing lens, and as such, the values and identity of this type tend to be highly nuanced, specific, and concrete. And as such, unlike the more amorphous and expansive identity of the ESFP, that of the ENFP tends to be much more set in stone. The Si-Fi divergent pairing of the ENFP tends to be the most naturally protective of all the types over individuality and the expression of such. Generally, trying to impose a set of restrictions upon an ENFP, telling them who they should be and how they should act, is generally a bad idea. While this is not a hard and fast rule, there is a general tendency for the values of this type to have a highly altruistic slant to them, especially when it concerns marginalized communities or underdogs. You see, just as an ENFP is protective over their own individuality, they tend to be protective over the individuality of other people. And the more specific a causal factor, the more the ENFP will tend to be riled up. And generally speaking, this Si-Fi divergent pairing is naturally egalitarian. While it is possible in some instances for the authority function to be subdued, and of course this is when we get into subtype theory, it is relatively rare for an ENFP to transgress the boundaries set by their values and identity. Generally speaking, self-concept acts as a kind of north star to guide the excursions of the dominant pairing. It is important, however, to resist conflating this type with the whole champion or campaigner stereotype. While ENFPs as a whole tend to be value-driven individuals with a compulsive need to not only hold true to but also act at the behest of these values are still individualized, and they won't always be a part of a greater moral superstructure. Especially when you mix in the nonconformist tendencies FI authority types as a whole can be prone to. And some variants of the ENFP can actually have a rather antagonistic relationship with their introverted feeling authority. And in these cases, there can be a tendency for the NeTe dominant pairing to become more combative, kind of being protective over an introverted feeling that has actually yet to be reconciled with the ego. As such, while the majority of ENFPs do tend to have a highly altruistic and humanitarian core, those of a more, say, convergent subtype actually have a capacity for a kind of love-hate relationship with their introverted feeling authority. A resentment of their compassionate tendencies and emotional sensitivities can actually subdue a high degree of introverted feeling convergence within this type. And these are the ENFPs who would more likely be seen by others as that kind of ESTJ stereotype, an individual who's a little bit more on a combative side. But in many ways, the subjugation of FI to the NeTe dominant pairing in these instances is actually to protect FI. It's not because the type does not value it per se. For all of the ambivalence, they actually value it so much that they just want to guard it from the harshness of external reality. And if you're trying to tell the difference between an FI insecure ENFP and an ESTJ, just look to not only the insecurity of introverted feeling, which the ESTJs would tend to have less than this type, but also to the relative blindness of introverted thinking, Is this individual capable of explaining their reasoning? Or do they just default to an external model? Extroverted intuitive association forming is still very much the MO of this type, however. So even when there are more extroverted thinking energies here, the type will still be a far cry from their ESTJ cousin. On the whole, though, the introverted feeling of this type is highly concrete, instilling a need for constant authenticity, and causing a kind of natural resentment of anybody who would impede upon authentic self-expression. And this type can actually be quite rebellious and even anti-establishment oriented. If you find self-concept to be less of an ongoing constant, even finding identity to morph and flux according to the needs of the individuals you are with, it is less likely you are an ENFP. Furthermore, if authentic self-expression tends to take second place to pragmatism or even social harmony, perhaps being more secondary to the outcome of an event, it is less likely you are this type. Furthermore, if you consider your values and needs to be less static, perhaps even more neutral, amorphous, or temperamental, you may have an NIFI pairing rather than an SIFI pairing. Sign number 5 that you are not an ENFP, the introverted sensing oppositional function. As aforementioned, the lens here informing introverted feeling is introverted sensing. So unlike their ESFP cousins, the divergent pairing of this type is SIFI rather than NIFI. This means that values and identity are less abstract and fluid, and rather, by comparison, much more concrete and static. And this is not to say, of course, that the values of the ENFP are entirely rigid and unable to adapt, but rather that the adaptations of this type are much more small and incremental and steady than explosive. Generally speaking, the values and boundaries of this type are on the harder side, and this tends to result in a certain resoluteness of character, unwavering values and convictions, and a tendency for the self to remain highly defined and conscious even amidst a sea of people. You see, as much as this type may get swept up in their adventures and causes, they will seldom lose sight of who they are. However, while introverted sensing has a very consistent and significant impact upon this type in that regard, employing it convergently can be a struggle for this type owing to its hyper-divergent nature. As such, as strong and influential as this divergent SI-FI pairing tend to be, more SI-centric modalities such as habit forming, consistency, and taking stock of resources, both internal and external, can actually be a little bit more of a challenge for this type. With the overwhelming amount of convergent energies, those energies that act and explore, directed towards the dominant NeTe pairing within this type, there can be a tendency for the type to neglect thorough inner consultation and verification, getting carried away in their external pursuits. And note this does not contradict the last point, because they'll still remain consistent to their internal values, just not necessarily their internal resources. You see, burnout can actually be a common thing for this type. In more unbalanced variants of this type, the new and novel are so perpetually chased as to make it rather difficult for the ENFP to establish any kind of permanence in their lives. They may start a new project, but fail to take enough control over SIFI to form the habit necessary to complete this project. They may take up myriad new interesting pursuits, only to crash and burn a few weeks later as their internal resources are depleted. It is generally imperative for this type to achieve a level of axial fluidity, lest they are caught within a spiral of novelty chasing at the expense of ever making a meaningful and lasting impact upon the world. You see, ENFPs that have a healthier relationship with their introverted sensing can achieve with greater ease a level of consistency in their lives and balance out the ratio of projects began to projects finished. If your mind tends to naturally focus upon a much more select amount of personal projects, for example, and with an equal amount of ease, forming the habits necessary in order to pursue these projects consistently, day in, day out, it is less likely you are this type. Furthermore, if you experience a more constant and intuitive surveillance of your internal resources, seldom biting off more than you can chew, and generally prioritizing the conservation of internal resources over their expenditure, it is again unlikely you are an ENFP. In fact, in this case, you may very well be an introvert. Bonus point: a tendency to over-rely upon intuitive feeling processing considered alongside the more volitional and therefore optional nature of thinking as a whole within this type tends to ensue an intuitive thinking blind spot. Now, while it is true that many ENFPs tend to report a level of insecurity with consciously directed internal thought, especially, when they're surrounded by people and the FE side of the FETI axis is accentuated, there is yet a good reason why this type tends to mistype as ENTP and indeed INTP. You see, while many ENFPs will be fully aware of their aversion to precise logical analysis, they do not rely entirely upon the relational deliberations of SIFI for their rationalization either. ENFPs certainly still think. However, such TI dialogue tends to be more of a subconscious hum within this type, and that TI which is engaged more effectively tends to be more extensive of an extroverted thinking origin point. That is to say, there's a good reason why ENFPs are so often fast on their feet and natural improvisers even in fields relatively new to them. There is also a reason why this type can pick up new skills so quickly and fluidly at a pace other types may envy. For as long as this type can see the logical values in front of them, employing intuitive thinking to both understand the mechanism and indeed innovate upon it, TI is not so much of a blind spot for this type. It is after all intuitive thinking assisting extroverted thinking that allows the type to find their oftentimes novel ways of overcoming various obstacles in their path, as well as, I might add, synergize and integrate the various projects I mentioned before into each other. However, when it comes to employing intuitive thinking independently of this NeTe origin point, the type can come up against substantial more resistance. What's more, outside of, say, a conversational format, an ENFP can actually struggle to hold specific thoughts within the head, especially for a prolonged amount of time. The ENFP may very well come to a correct logical deduction, perhaps one that a more TI conscious type may have missed even. But when asked to explain their reasoning, the type may on occasion default to generalizations and underlying principles, and this can lead to an insecurity with their very intelligence, even manifesting as a more combative variant of this type who feels they need to be at the top of their game around other people in order to prove their intellectual might, worth, mettle to themselves and to some extent the people who they are surrounded with. However, this type is so adept at such oftentimes improvised big picture generalizations that they may end up concluding themselves a Ti dominant even on the basis of how many arguments they end up winning. But it is very important to note that the TI blindness of the ENFP pertains much more to SITI, precise critique and analysis, than it does of the more generalist NITI pairing, which is a pairing that operates more extensively off the dominant functions. It is for this reason that ENFPs tend to be much more adept at generalist and more philosophical ways of thinking, and substantially more aversive to more precise logical analysis and technical expertise. As adept as an ENFP may be at justifying an opinion on a very broad, high-level manner, actually tracing the sequence of cognitive events back to how that opinion was actually formed in the first place can be much more of a struggle for this type, as can be backing up their claims with precise references to various facts, figures, and more precise elements of theoretical frameworks. As such, if you find precise internal analysis to be much more of an ongoing constant within your psyche, easily and eagerly honing into the very minute details in order to ensure no stone is left unturned within your logical discourse, it is less likely you are an ENFP. Furthermore, if you can easily consult and communicate the relevant facts of any given subject, easily working in a sequential manner from the ground up, rather than, defaulting to the overarching principle and relying upon other people to fill in the blanks of your statement, it is less likely you are an ENFP. And yes, I'm very careful with my wording here because you have to factor in type development. These videos apply to the default versions of any given type, so there will always be exceptions based upon the extent of a person's cognitive development. And that's why I say unlikely rather than absolutely not. As much as we may all seek simplicity within the personality typing domain, the fact is humans are fluid and complex. So that concludes the video. I really hope this has been informative, and if you know anyone who you think might benefit from the contents of this video, be sure to share it with them as well. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button below, and it would be amazing to hear from you in the comments as well. The second edition of the CPT book, and I say book now because you can actually get a print edition, is now released. I've heard really great responses from people, and I think you'll really enjoy it if you haven't already got it. If at the end of this video you're still uncertain about whether or not you are an ENFP, I do recommend checking out the CPT type service, because then we can go into much more depth and nuance as to your unique and underlying cognition. And I also offer type coaching for anybody who is interested in type development, the growth of the cognitive functions, or just the application of the cognitive functions towards any given project that they are pursuing. And finally, CPT is also on Patreon, so if you're interested in supporting the channel in a theory on that additional level, it would be absolutely amazing to see you there. But of course, I already appreciate your support over here as well. I did take a bit of a hiatus last year, but as you can now tell, I am back with regular content, and it does feel good to get this ball rolling again. So spread the word, share the videos, and I can't wait to see you again in a couple of weeks. For now, take care.